When General Dwight D. Eisenhower listed the 4 pieces of equipment most vital to Allied victory in World War II, he didn't start with tanks or bombers or battleships. He listed the bulldozer, the jeep, the 2.5-ton truck, and the C-47 transport plane. Curiously enough, he noted, none of these are designed for combat. This is the story of one of those weapons, the GMC CCKW, known to everyone who drove it, loaded it, or depended on it as the Deuce and a half. This is the story of how a simple truck became the lifeline of armies, how it carried the weight of victory on its steel frame, and how the men who drove it, 75% of them African-American soldiers fighting 2 wars at once, kept entire armies moving when victory hung in the balance. This is the story of the truck that won the war. 1940. The world was burning. France had fallen. Britain was being bombed into rubble. The Soviet Union would soon be fighting for its life. America wasn't in the war yet, but everyone knew it was coming. The question wasn't if, but when. The U.S. Army looked at its equipment and saw a problem. The trucks they had were converted commercial vehicles, civilian designs, hastily painted olive drab and pressed into military service. They were fine for peacetime, for moving supplies around bases in comfortable conditions. But war wasn't comfortable. War was mud and snow and desert sand. War was driving through the night without headlights. War was keeping an army supplied across thousands of miles of hostile territory. The army needed something better, something purpose-built, something that could go anywhere, carry anything, and keep running no matter what the enemy or the weather threw at it. In 1940, the Army put out specifications for a new medium truck. It had to carry 2.5 tons of cargo. It had to have all-wheel drive for off-road capability. It had to fit on Navy transport ships for overseas deployment. It had to be simple enough for mass production, because they would need thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands. Several companies submitted designs. GMC's Yellow Truck and Coach Division, based in Pontiac, Michigan, submitted a design based on their successful commercial truck models. The Army tested it, evaluated it, compared it to the competition, and in early 1941, GMC won the contract. The GMC CCKW went into production in February 1941. The designation was pure GMC terminology. C for the 1941 model year, C for conventional cab, K for all-wheel drive, W for dual rear axles, CCKW. The soldiers who would drive it didn't care about designations. They called it the Jimmy, a play on the GM name. They called it the Deuce and a half for its 2.5-ton payload. They called it a lifesaver, a workhorse, and sometimes, when it broke down in the middle of nowhere, they called it other things too. But mostly, they just called it reliable. The Deuce and a half wasn't complicated. That was the point. It had a GMC 270 cubic inch inline 6-cylinder engine producing 104 horsepower. Not powerful by modern standards, but enough. It had a 5-speed manual transmission with an overdrive 5th gear. It had a 2-speed transfer case that engaged the front axle for all-wheel drive. It had hydraulic brakes with vacuum assist. It had leaf spring suspension on all 3 axles. Everything about it was designed for simplicity, reliability, and ease of repair. Parts were standardized, systems were straightforward. A mechanic with basic tools could fix most problems in the field. That mattered, because these trucks wouldn't be maintained in comfortable garages by trained technicians. They'd be maintained in muddy fields by tired soldiers working by flashlight. The truck came in two wheelbase lengths. The short version, the CCKW 352, had a 145-inch wheelbase and was used primarily as an artillery prime mover to tow 75mm and 105mm howitzers. The long version, the CCKW 353, had a 164-inch wheelbase and became the standard cargo truck. This was the version everyone remembers, the iconic image of a Deuce and a half with its tall cargo bed and canvas cover. Production started slowly in 1941, about 8,000 trucks that first year. Then America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, and production exploded. GMC built a second factory in St. Louis to keep up with demand. By 1942, they were building thousands per month. By 1943, tens of thousands per month. The factories ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers, many of them women who had taken jobs vacated by men who went to war, assembled trucks as fast as humanly possible. By the time production ended in 1945, GMC had built over 562,000 CCKW trucks. 562,000. That's more than any other U.S. military vehicle except the Jeep. It represented almost a quarter of all the trucks the U.S. military acquired during the entire war. The Deuce and a half went everywhere. Every theater, every front. Europe, the Pacific, North Africa, Italy. The trucks crossed deserts where temperatures hit 120 degrees. They climbed mountains where the air was so thin engines struggled to breathe. They drove through Russian winters where temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and oil turned to sludge. They churned through mud in Burma and jungle trails in the Philippines, and they kept running. The cargo bed could carry 5,000 pounds of supplies, ammunition crates, food rations, medical supplies, fuel drum, anything an army needed. The wooden sides folded down to make loading easier. Troop seats folded up along each side, allowing the truck to carry either cargo or 16 fully equipped soldiers. Many trucks had a machine gun ring mounted above the passenger seat, and about 25% were equipped with a .50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun for convoy defense. Some trucks had front-mounted winches that could pull 10,000 pounds, essential for recovering stuck vehicles or moving obstacles. Others were modified into dozens of specialized variants. Fuel tankers carrying 750 gallons. Water tankers, mobile workshops, field hospitals, communications vehicles with radio equipment, dump trucks, fire trucks. Anything the military needed, there was probably a Deuce and a half variant for it. But the standard cargo truck was the hero. The workhorse. The truck that showed up every day and did the job nobody else wanted to do. By 1944, American and British forces had landed in Normandy. D-Day, June 6, 1944. Over 1 million Allied soldiers poured onto the beaches and began pushing inland. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history, and it worked. The Allies had a foothold in France. But having a foothold and keeping it supplied were two different problems. The pre-invasion bombing campaign had destroyed much of the French rail system. Bridges were down. Rail yards were craters. The Allies controlled only one major port, Cherbourg, and it was 350 miles from the front lines. Everything the advancing armies needed, ammunition, fuel, food, spare parts, medical supplies, had to come through Cherbourg and be trucked hundreds of miles to the front. On July 25, 1944, Operation Cobra began. American forces broke out of the Normandy hedgerows and began racing across France. General George Patton's Third Army was at the spearhead, advancing so fast that German forces couldn't establish defensive lines. Patton's tanks were covering 80 miles a day, punching deep into France, liberating towns and villages, destroying German units caught in the open. It was a stunning success. It was also a logistics nightmare. Patton's Third Army alone consumed 800,000 gallons of fuel per day. 800,000 gallons. Every day. Plus ammunition, plus food, plus everything else an army of 250,000 men needs to function. And all of it had to be trucked from Cherbourg, hundreds of miles away, over narrow French country roads that were never designed for military traffic. By mid-August, the supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. Patton's tanks were literally running out of gas. Ammunition was being rationed. The spectacular advance that had the Germans reeling was grinding to a halt, not because of enemy resistance, but because of logistics. General Omar Bradley wrote in his autobiography that on both fronts, an acute shortage of supplies governed all operations. War correspondent Ernie Pyle called it a tactician's hell and a quartermaster's purgatory. Something had to be done. Fast. On August 16th, 1944, in a frantic 36-hour planning session, Allied commanders created the Red Ball Express. The name came from an old railroad term. To red ball something meant to ship it express, with absolute priority over everything else. Red ball trains in America had the right of way over all other traffic. The Red Ball Express would work the same way. The system was simple but massive. 2 parallel one-way highways stretching from Cherbourg to the front lines. The northern route for trucks carrying supplies forward. The southern route for empty trucks returning. The roads were closed to all civilian traffic. Red Ball trucks had absolute priority on regular roads. Military police controlled every intersection, waving Red Ball convoys through without stopping. The trucks operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Drivers worked in shifts, 2 men per truck, trading off every few hours. A round trip could take 54 hours and cover 750 miles of driving. There were no breaks, no days off. When you finished one run, you turned around and started another. The Red Ball Express officially began operations on August 25, 1944. On that first day, over 6,000 trucks rolled. Most of them were deuce and a halves. They carried 12,342 tons of supplies to forward depots in a single day. 12,000 tons. It was a record that wasn't matched during the entire 83-day operation. And here's the part of the story that often gets overlooked, the part that deserves to be front and center. 75% of the Red Ball Express drivers were African American soldiers. The U.S. Army in World War II was segregated. Black soldiers were assigned almost exclusively to service and supply units, not because they lacked courage or skill, but because of racism, pure and simple. Military leadership believed that black soldiers weren't capable of combat roles. So they were assigned to quartermaster companies, transportation battalions, port operations, loading and unloading cargo, and driving trucks. When the Red Ball Express was formed, the army pulled drivers from everywhere they could find them. They grabbed truck companies from supply depots across Normandy. They took soldiers whose regular duties weren't critical and trained them as drivers. They assembled 23,000 drivers to operate 6,000 trucks. And of those 23,000 drivers, over 17,000 were black. These men had trained as soldiers. Many wanted to fight in combat units. Instead, they were assigned to drive trucks. But when the Red Ball Express started rolling, those drivers became absolutely vital to Allied victory. They weren't support troops anymore. They were the lifeline. Without them, the advance would have stopped cold. The driving conditions were brutal. Convoys moved day and night. During daylight, they drove with pedal to the metal, pushing the trucks as fast as they could on narrow, winding roads. At night, they drove with cat eyes, tiny slits of light barely visible from a few feet away, because full headlights would draw German artillery or air attack. The roads were marked with red balls painted on signs every few miles. French civilians were warned to stay off red ball routes. Posters in French went up in every town. These roads belonged to the American army. Do not use them. The drivers adopted a French phrase as their motto. Tout de suite, immediately. Right now. That was the Red Ball Express. Everything was urgent. Everything was priority. Patton wanted supplies, and he wanted them tout de suite. Technical Sergeant James Rucard, a Red Ball driver, recalled years later, when General Patton said for you to be there, you were there if you had to drive all day and all night. If those trucks broke down, we'd fix them and they'd run again. The trucks broke down constantly, not because they were poorly built, but because they were being driven beyond their limits. 18-hour days, overloaded, racing over bad roads. The Deuce and a half was reliable, but nothing can withstand that kind of abuse indefinitely. Transmissions overheated. Tires wore out. 50,000 tires in the first month alone. Engines needed constant maintenance. But the drivers and mechanics kept them rolling. They worked miracles with wrenches and wire and sheer determination. If a truck broke down on the road, the driver fixed it right there. If he couldn't fix it, another truck would tow it to a depot where mechanics worked around the clock. The Red Ball couldn't stop. Too much depended on it. The trucks carried everything. Gasoline in 5-gallon jerrycans, thousands of them stacked in cargo beds. Ammunition crates, 105mm shells for artillery, .50 caliber rounds for machine guns, hand grenades, rifle ammunition, food rations in wooden crates, medical supplies, spare parts. Everything an army consumes. An average division required 700 tons of supplies per day. By late summer 1944, there were over 24 divisions pushing across France. That's almost 20,000 tons per day. The Red Ball Express was delivering 12,000 tons daily at peak operation. It wasn't quite enough, but it was close, and it was enough to keep the armies moving. The German army watched in amazement. The Wehrmacht still relied heavily on horses for transportation. A typical German division had nearly 10 times as many horses as motor vehicles. They ran on oats as much as on gasoline. German logistics were limited by how fast horses could walk and how much they could pull. The Americans were entirely mechanized. Everything moved by truck or tank or jeep. The speed difference was staggering. German infantry divisions could march maybe 20 miles a day. American mechanized units could cover 80 miles. The Germans couldn't keep up, couldn't establish defensive lines, couldn't regroup, before the next American attack hit them. Patton understood what the Red Ball Express meant. He called the 2.5-ton truck our most valuable weapon. Not the Sherman tank, not the P-47 fighter. The truck. Colonel John Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander's son, wrote years later that without the Red Ball Express drivers, the advance across France could not have been made. It wouldn't have stalled. It wouldn't have slowed down. It simply could not have been made at all. But the drivers paid a price for their service. They faced discrimination even as they performed vital work. Living conditions were segregated. Black drivers got the older trucks, the ones more likely to break down. If supplies went missing, black drivers were blamed first. They were warned not to fraternize with white soldiers during off-duty hours. Washington Rector of the 3916th Quartermaster Truck Company remembered, "You accepted discrimination. We were warned not to fraternize with whites for fear problems would arise." The racism was so pervasive that even today, some white veterans of the Red Ball Express are unaware that most of the drivers were black. The segregation was so complete that they simply never interacted. But the black drivers kept rolling. They had a job to do, and they did it. They drove through exhaustion. They drove through fear. They drove knowing that if they broke down in the wrong place, German forces might capture or kill them. They drove knowing that their country treated them as second-class citizens but expected first-class performance. And they delivered. Every time. To Deuce. General Eisenhower sent a message to Red Ball Express personnel in October 1944. The Red Ball line is the lifeline between combat and supply. To it falls the tremendous task of getting vital supplies from ports and depots to the combat troops, when and where such supplies are needed, material without which the armies might fail. To you drivers and mechanics and your officers, who keep the Red Ball vehicles constantly moving, I wish to express my deep appreciation. You're doing an excellent job. Frontline soldiers knew it too. A tank commander from the 5th Armored Division said, "If it wasn't for the Red Ball, we couldn't have moved. They all were black drivers, and they delivered in the heat of combat. We'd be in our tanks praying for them to come up." Another Armored Division commander said the black drivers delivered gas under constant fire. Damned if I'd want their job. They have what it takes. The Red Ball Express operated for 83 days, from August 25th through November the 16th, 1944. In those 83 days, the trucks transported 412,193 tons of supplies. 412,000 tons. Everything from bullets to bandages. Everything an army needs to fight and win. By November, the situation had changed. The port of Antwerp in Belgium had been captured and opened, providing a much closer supply point. French rail lines had been repaired enough to move supplies by train. Portable fuel pipelines had been laid from the coast to forward areas. The emergency was over. On November the 16th, 1944, the Red Ball Express was officially terminated. The trucks and drivers returned to their regular units. But the legend was established. The Red Ball Express had become part of World War II mythology, a symbol of American logistics, of black soldiers proving themselves despite discrimination, of ordinary men doing extraordinary things. The GMC Deuce and a half kept serving long after the Red Ball Express ended. The trucks fought across France, through Belgium, into Germany. They crossed the Rhine. They supplied the final push into the heart of the Third Reich. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Deuce and a halves were there, carrying the mail and supplies that kept occupation forces functioning. In the Pacific, they fought a different war: jungle warfare, island hopping, mud and heat and tropical diseases. The Deuce and a half adapted. It always adapted. After World War II ended, the military didn't retire the Deuce and a half. It was too good, too reliable, too useful. The trucks served in Korea in the 1950s, carrying supplies through mountain passes and frozen roads. They served in Vietnam in the 1960s, rumbling down jungle trails and muddy roads. Some served into the 1990s with National Guard units. Other countries bought surplus Deuce and a halves after the war: France, Britain, Belgium, Israel, dozens of nations. The trucks appeared in conflicts around the world. They became one of the most common military vehicles of the Cold War era, recognizable anywhere. Today, thousands of Deuce and a halves still exist. Many are in museums, restored to mint condition, painted olive drab with white stars on the doors. Others are in private hands, owned by collectors who maintain them and drive them in parades and military vehicle rallies. Some are still working trucks, hauling cargo on farms and construction sites, 80 years after they were built and still running. The GMC CCKW, the Deuce and a half, the Jimmy, whatever name you use. This truck represents something fundamental about how America fought and won World War II. Not with wonder weapons or secret technology or brilliant generals, though all of those helped. America won with logistics, with production, with the ability to build 500,000 trucks and send them around the world and keep them running and supplied no matter what. America won because when the front lines needed supplies, the supplies arrived. Every time. Reliably. Massively. The Deuce and a half was the backbone of that system. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't exciting. Nobody made movies about cargo trucks the way they made movies about fighter pilots and tank commanders. But the pilots and tankers all knew the truth. Without the trucks, without the supplies, without the drivers, they couldn't fight. The most advanced weapons in the world are useless if they run out of fuel and ammunition. Eisenhower knew it when he listed the truck among the 4 most vital pieces of equipment. Patton knew it when he called it his most valuable weapon. The soldiers knew it when they watched the Red Ball convoys rolling past, bringing the ammunition and fuel that would let them attack tomorrow. And the drivers knew it. The 23,000 men who drove the Red Ball Express, 75% of them black, knew they were doing something important. They were keeping armies moving. They were shortening the war. They were saving lives, even if nobody thanked them for it at the time. The GMC Deuce and a half didn't win the war by itself. No single weapon or vehicle or technology wins a war, but it was essential. Remove it from the equation and everything changes. The advance across France stalls. The liberation of Europe takes longer. More soldiers die. More civilians suffer. The war drags on, but the Deuce and a half was there. Over 562,000 of them. Reliable, rugged, ready, carrying the weight of victory across thousands of miles of hostile territory, breaking down and being fixed and getting back on the road, day after day, night after night, tout de suite. In the end, that's how wars are won. Not with the biggest gun or the fastest plane, but with the unglamorous work of keeping armies supplied, keeping them moving, keeping them in the fight. The GMC Deuce and a half did that job better than any truck before or since. It was just a truck. Simple, utilitarian, mass-produced. Nothing special about the engineering, nothing revolutionary about the design. But it showed up every day, in every theater, in every kind of weather, on every kind of road. And it did the job. That's what won the war. Not brilliance, not innovation, just showing up and doing the job, day after day until the job was done. The Deuce and a half showed up, the drivers showed up, and together they helped win the war. When you see one today in a museum or at a military vehicle show, take a moment to appreciate what it represents. Not just a truck, but the thousands of men who drove them, maintained them, loaded them, and depended on them. The black soldiers who drove 75% of the Red Ball Express runs. The mechanics who kept them running on 3 hours of sleep. The commanders who understood that logistics matter as much as tactics. The GMC Deuce and a half. The truck that won the war. Not because it was the best truck ever built, but because when the world needed it most, it was there, and it worked every single time.